Nearly hidden in the trees of Howard Amon Park, a large concrete structure sits modestly alone. Its bright white shell stretches like a sail to the Columbia River beyond. For 24 years, this lone sentinel has welcomed neighbors and visitors to its stage. Concerts or plays on a sunny spring day, a meeting place for groups, or a playground for the occasional child who lightheartedly tests the echoing property of the structure. The ellipsoid, the sail, jaws, or the eggshell, known by many names, but for most in Richland, we just call it the fingernail. For as long as most Richlanders can remember, this strange-shaped concrete shell was a landmark at the south entrance of Richland. Constructed in 1963 as business offices for True Stone Concrete, the building was inspired from a sailing trip on Lake Washington by owner Dick Hughes. True Stone operated out of a building until 1968, when the structure was purchased by Acme Concrete. Acme bought the property because they wanted the gravel below it and had no use for the ellipsoid. Thus, the great white structure sat alone, except for the occasional vandal who couldn't resist aiming a stone at the giant glass window. In 1980, the property was sold to the state of Washington, who wanted to use the land and gravel for its new I-182 freeway connecting Richland and Kennewick. The Department of Transportation had located the center line of the new freeway right through the shell and planned to demolish the building as it seemed to serve no other purpose. But then again, no one had consulted James Dillman, a local Richland architect and community activist, about the demolition plans.
The Highway Department was talking about building I-182 through the Tri-Cities, and there in the middle of this field, right in the way of the new highway, was this big shell structure which was built as an office for Concrete Products Company at the time. So it was more or less kind of abandoned. I was looking at that shell and having the experience of being an acoustician when I was working in Seattle, I looked at that and said, boy, I think that would make a great band shell. So I got Ted Plute, our symphony conductor at the time, together with me, and we walked out to that structure and we walked around and we clapped and we whistled and we determined that it had pretty good projection. There was one little space that was maybe not quite perfect, but pretty much it was a great band shell. And so I asked them, I said, could I have that structure? And they said, if you can move it, you can have it. So then I went to the city of Richland and I said, I'd like to move this shell into the park to use it as a band shell. And they all looked and said, okay. And I said, I'd like to put it in Howard Amon Park, and I'd like to put it about here. And they all hemmed and hawed a bit. And finally they said, okay. And then I said, I have talked to a house moving company, Cope House Moving in Kennewick, and they told me it would probably cost about $11,000 to put it on the truck and haul it to Richland and park it in the park. And I said to the council, if I can do that, and I'm going to try to get the money from the citizens in the community, would you back me on it? And they said, okay. I was told later they never thought it would happen.
And with the blessing from City Council, the fundraising drive was underway. A project name was needed. Someone with a mathematical background told Dillman that the shape of the structure was a non-segmented ellipsoid. He felt this name fit Richland's scientific community and dubbed the project the Non-Segmented Ellipsoid Transfer. It was with extreme enthusiasm that Dillman pressed forward. He was convinced that a wellspring of residents would join him, with shovels in hand, to move this band shell to Howard Amon Park. Even though many organizations and private citizens donated money to the project, Dillman found himself relatively alone with a sledgehammer and shovel as he began to remove the old concrete floor slab.
Being the kind of person that I am, I then had all the permissions that I needed, and I went out to the structure with my shovel and my pickaxe, and I began to remove all the parts that were not important to the structure, including digging the whole foundation, which was 5 feet deep, underneath that building. It turns out that that structure weighed 60 tons, or maybe more, but 60 tons. And so I dug it out, and then periodically I would call over to Acme Concrete, and they'd send a 10-yard loader over and pull the soil that I dug out, the gravel actually, there was lots of gravel, away from the structure so I could continue digging. And I dug the whole thing out in the winter, I think it was, I can't remember exactly. I did have some help from some of my staff on occasion, and then I was also asking for money, and one lady brought me $5 to help move this structure, and I thanked her very much because she wanted to be a part of this thing.
Finally, in the fall of 1982, the ellipsoid was ready to be moved. Cope House Moving backed its tow truck into place and hooked onto the support beams that had been placed under the structure. The tow truck roared with all its power but did not move. Instead, its front wheels rose up 12 feet off the ground to a 45-degree angle. A surprised driver put the truck in reverse, and soon the front wheels were back on the ground. More pulling weight was needed. Acme Concrete sent over 2 10-yard front-end loaders with their buckets filled with gravel. Soon, 3 huge engines roared to life, and the ellipsoid slowly moved forward.
It started pulling it out of the hole, and in front of the hole, in this gravel, and the gravel is like boulder rocks that are about 3 inches in diameter and 2 inches in diameter, etc. A wave began to develop in front of the little tires, and the wave got to be about 3 feet high, and we realized that what we were doing was like pushing water. We weren't going to make this go. So Cope says, wait a minute, and he goes back to the front end of his truck, and he hauls out a whole bunch of little 3/8 inch thick pads of plywood. They were like 3 by 3 or something like that, or 2 by 2 even. And then I dug all the gravel from the wave out in front of the tires, and we shoved these little pieces of plywood in front of the tires. And then when it moved, guess what? It went right up on top of those little pieces of plywood and came right out of the ground. So we moved it over to the edge of the field and up to the edge of Wellesian Way, and that's how far we got the first day.
Bright and early the next day, the ellipsoid began its slow move down Wellesian Way. A one-float parade broke out with citizens snapping pictures and cheering as the giant structure rolled by. Traffic was stopped on George Washington Way, and the traffic lights swung aside by City of Richland crews as the structure reached the brink of the hill that looked down into Howard Amon Park. Dillman knew this would be the most critical part of the move, for if the ellipsoid were to get out of control, it would careen down the hill like a giant tricycle and plunge into the Columbia River.
Well, we managed to get it down and around the corner, and the previous week I had the City of Richland dig me a hole in the park where this structure was going to be sitting. And so we pulled around and we pulled into that hole, and of course it's soft dirt in there too, you know, it's river bottom stuff. And we pulled around in there, and I looked at it for a minute, and I says, you know, Mr. Cope, we have to turn this thing about 1 foot this direction. So he turned the wheels on the truck, and he gave a big grunt, and we turned it about, I think about a foot, foot and a half, exactly where I said, stop, that's it. So there we stopped, and we had it in the park, in amongst the trees.
Weeks went by as Dillman and an occasional helper prepared the concrete stage and tamped down the backfilled dirt provided by city crews. The non-segmented ellipsoid transfer project was nearly complete, and Dillman found himself pondering what citizens may think of their new bandshell structure.
Finally got it all dug out and got it all compacted back. And one morning in February, it was a cold February morning, when I was finally almost up to the surface, but there was still another big pile of dirt sitting behind me. I was sitting there having a cup of tea about 10 in the morning. It was probably about 34 degrees and misty, and it was early. It was probably 8 o'clock or 8:30. And I heard some people coming from way behind me back up over the park. And I could hear a little voice and a mom and a dad. And so I continued to have my tea, and then suddenly I heard the little voice say, "The Fingernail, the Fingernail." And I said to myself, okay, it's the Fingernail. Who cares?
And so it is, the Fingernail, a distinctive and recognizable Richland landmark. For the past 24 years, a host to small gatherings and large community events, saved from an inevitable demise by one man with an infectious spirit who proves that anything can be accomplished if you just refuse to quit.
Well, I thought it was a lovely band shell. Just as simple as that. And I thought, well, we ought to have it in the park. And if we ought to have it in the park, somebody has to put it there.
Thanks to James Dillman, who saw beyond the adversities to save this unique structure for Richland. The ellipsoid, the sail, or as we like to call it, the fingernail.